Good morning. Welcome back. All right. So I'm just gonna wait for this. So I inadvertently gave you a bit of a semester break. All right, more rest. Can you believe it? More rest was needed. But we have actually finished the next 5 books. If we're looking at it in view of semester, we're in semester 4. So Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, and Proverbs was our next 5 that we were supposed to cover. This is our 4th grouping of 5 books that we actually had finished. I realized until just this morning as I was trying to figure out, what was my next step here. Of course, we will be moving into Ecclesiastes after this and continuing our regular scheduled program. But I thought to just as I have a few minutes left for this morning, we're just to go over the popular themes that we had covered over these last 5 books and how they do all relate to each other despite being in different time settings and settings, right? Nehemiah was covering really the rebuilding of Jerusalem after their last tyrannical leader of Nebuchadnezzar. So that was covering that time zone. Esther was also around that time, a bit after that time, covering those 2 different kings, King Xerxes. And then we had Job, which does allow for some same themes as they all do relate, but that was taking place way before, like around Genesis era. Anyways, we do know Psalms, of course, was during David's time. Proverbs was during Solomon's time. But we do all have these relating in similar themes, so perhaps this is why they are grouped together the way that they are, because they move through these themes, and they do relate to each other in some way, and we will talk about the way that they are related together. Excuse me. So first we're going to cover here some dichotomies, because that was a popular theme that we covered in Proverbs, right? This way or that way, this side of the fence or this side of the fence. But these dichotomies determine whether there is progression and movement or if there's a bit of a standstill. So we discover these works of progression or movement when we cover leadership versus tyranny. So there was a tyrannical leader here in Esther. It was more so Haman, right, who was the bad guy, who was suggesting all of these evil things to the king, and Esther was on the other side of that, trying to combat that. We also have Nehemiah, right? He was a good leader, right? Nehemiah was a good leader. Let me just look and make sure that I'm speaking correctly. But they were recovering from tyranny, right? They were recovering from the epic rule of Nebuchadnezzar, which really did destroy Israel and Jerusalem as a whole. And let me just go back to Nehemiah really quickly, making sure, because I know Ezra was in there too, but that was part of our last couplet, so I am getting a little bit confused who was the leader in Nehemiah. And of course, you guys, I had to go back and look myself because just a little bit of a scan brings back and floods back all of those memories of what we spoke about prior. But Nehemiah was very, very much about the rebuilding as well. So we were rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the gates. Everybody had joined in togetherness to go ahead and rebuild the fortifications, if you will, of Jerusalem, of Israel. So, hold on one second. I might as well just go get my book because... Okay, that's what I thought. So, Prophet Ezra is also in the book of Nehemiah, which was the book before Nehemiah was Ezra. So he was present in Nehemiah, and I do remember Nehemiah and Ezra, they kind of overlap each other in this next book of Nehemiah. But Nehemiah was the leader, okay, of this book. He was the main protagonist, if you will. We also talked about abundance versus lack, very, very prevalent in Job, right? The abundance that Job had at one point versus the lack that he had that caused him really a true stagnation, okay? He was really frozen in his grief. He was grief-stricken. He didn't know how to move forward, but eventually he did, right? And the abundance actually followed him, moving forward and moving through that period of utter chaos, I would say, chaos and destruction and lack. And then, of course, we had some lack in Nehemiah. If we remember, the Israelites were facing a period of famine, of poverty. Okay, they did not know what was going on as far as the taxation. They were being taxed heavily. There was a lot of issues there, and it was causing them a bit of stagnation, a lack of movement due to their lack, material lack. But once the abundance started to flow in, they had the resources to build Israel back up. They were well on their way once again. And then we also have this other dichotomy here, discerning the power of suggestion versus the power of thought. Okay, so anybody can suggest something. We can argue that if you act upon the suggestion, right, you are moving forward, right? You are, well, maybe not forward, but you are moving, right? There is some sort of progression. But if you're acting on the power of a suggestion, that is really not your own will, if you will. It's somebody else's will that you are acting in a part of. So we have to discern this power of suggestion, because while you might be moving forward with action after suggestion, it is not always your right path. You might be kind of taking a little bit of a sidestep, and while you think you're moving forward, you're moving along the side. Or, I wouldn't say moving backward, but you're moving kind of like you're rebooting yourself only to meet yourself back at that point where you may have not taken the suggestion. And instead, we have the power of thought. So really actually taking your time to think through things and exercise your power of thought, plan, if you will, mourn, do whatever you need to do. Use your thought to propel you forward, because that's going to keep you within your will. And then if you're connected to God ever so closely, it will keep you in alignment with God's will as well. So we need to discern this power of suggestion, because we are suggested things, I think, more often than not. And so just looking after this power of suggestion and how we can more closely align with God's will, right, is to really think about things and focus on your own power of thought. So this was a very crucial point in the book of Esther, when we had Haman doing those powers of suggestion on the king, and he was trying to suggest to really kill all of the Jewish people in the community and kill all of the Israelites. The way that he was going to do that, as we remember, was he was unintentional. The king was not intentional with it, but Haman was certainly intentional. The king was not as aware, but Haman was certainly aware. But Haman was using his power of suggestion. Now Esther, she was more so using, although she was making various suggestions, right? She was really thinking through things. She fasted, she prayed, she mourned, right? She cried out to the Lord and asked for assistance. But she had a plan, right? She used her own thought and her own will and her own wisdom to go ahead and create this plan to bring Haman down eventually. So that's why it's important to just pause, right? Be in your own wisdom and be in your own self and move forward that way versus, taking the other route. Next up we have, so those were more the works of progression, what can cause either stagnation or progression and movement. Now we have, works of togetherness / oneness. These are not dichotomies. These are, I guess you can call it like a duality, but togetherness, think family, think community, think of, being with one's family or community. And then we also have oneness, which is being all together as one and being connected with the Lord, most importantly. So these themes that we covered, we have the rebuilding, the remolding, the reshaping, that definitely took place very heavily in Nehemiah. We could argue that it was present in Job once he was regathering himself, if you will. Esther was very present in Esther as well. And all of these themes, we can find bits and pieces in each book, but I just, did the main one. Like, obviously Nehemiah, they were rebuilding the gates of Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple. It was very, very heavily present there. We also have the stages of grief and mourning, very, very present in Job. As we remember, that was the bulk of that book. We also have Nehemiah. She was mourning definitely the loss of her fellow Israelites, or the potential loss of her fellow Israelites. Esther, in Esther. Nehemiah, there was some stages of grief and mourning. Remember when the Israelites were acting out, right? Going against the grain, trying to join in with the other communities, and they were like intermarrying, right, with the communities that they weren't supposed to. There was some grief and mourning that both Ezra and Nehemiah were experiencing because they were in shock that the Israelites would even go that direction. And then Psalms actually was very, very heavy in mourning and grief. David was crying out to the Lord many, many a times through his Psalms, through his pleas, right, crying out to the Lord and mourning the various issues that he was going through. I found it very prevalent in Psalms as well. And then with that, we also have the reliance upon the Lord. Very, very heavy in Psalms. Okay, who was David reaching out to every time? Who was he calling out to every time? God, right? Reliance upon the Lord is very, very heavy, and it really does emphasize that oneness with the Lord, okay? Being together, having somebody that you can go to, but knowing, that one relationship is the only thing that you need to propel forward again. And we also have Nehemiah, very heavily reliant upon the Lord, taking the Lord's suggestion, and I shouldn't say suggestion, but guidance, right? Guidance to go ahead and move forward and to enact his plans. Job, same thing. Although he was very heavy in his grief and he didn't know, how to react, he reacted very, very heavily on the Lord. He was calling out to the Lord, asking him questions, right? Demanding answers from the Lord. Very, very heavily reliant on the Lord. In Job, Esther, same thing. Fasting, praying, heavily relying on the Lord. And we know that that brings them out of their struggles every time. So we have here the last one. The last popular theme was the instilling of wisdom and expounding upon understanding. So Job actually provided us with, I think, honestly, the best and most succinct definition of what is wisdom, what is understanding, although we did cover that in Jesus's explanation. Wisdom, right, is fear of the Lord. Understanding is shunning evil. Okay, it's very easy to remember. I think it's the best and, again, most succinct definition. So we're instilling this fear of the Lord, okay? Very, very heavily in Proverbs, very, very heavily in Job. All right, we were fearful of the Lord, that the Lord could even, cause these things to come upon Job. And then Proverbs as well, we were fearful of our own selves, that we were on that other side of the dichotomy, that we could be the problem sometimes, right? So we were fearful of ourselves. We had that fear of the Lord and of our fate even. We were a little bit fearful of our fate. But who holds that? The Lord holds that. So instilling this wisdom, aka instilling the fear of the Lord, was very, very heavy. Psalms, we had some of that experience as well. And then expounding upon understanding, which is shunning evil, okay? Job was more or less, right, focusing on this, shutting out all of his evil thoughts, even though they had overtaken him sometimes. Proverbs, right, shunning evil, we know certain things, right, which dichotomy to go with. We have that understanding. Psalms as well, right, there's moments where David has to really force himself to shut out all his negative thinking as well. Shunning evil grants you a greater understanding and a greater closeness with the Lord. So I know it seems like these books were kind of, very varying in theme and a little bit all over the place, but by just focusing on these main points, I think we could see how they all relate, and what our duty was through reading all of those books, and what our duty continues to be, will be these themes. More so these works of togetherness, oneness, also these works of progression and movement, right? Staying on this leadership, abundance, power of thought. We have gone through some things as well as we were reading. We had a whole presidential election. We had a whole planetary alignment, okay? So these tools are going to help us, put a good cap on this next stage of our time here, right? Our development, I guess, as human beings, as members of society. These points right here are going to really put a cap. If we still have things to work on, we focus on them as they bring us forward through these next 5 books, because we're going to get into some, assuming, pretty serious topics here in Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books when I was first introduced, but we'll see as we read through it if it's still my favorite. We'll have to do some deciding then. But I appreciate you guys listening. Thanks for hanging out with me and taking in that little semester break. But I will get back to you guys soon, and we will do some more learning. Have a good